Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're continuing in the Ben La'ashri. We're in Parshat Vayeishev. As we mention every week, the learning should be Luli Nishmas, the Tzadik Miranana, Rabbi Yitzchak HaKoyim, and Osher Anshel Horberman. This week's Parsha, the Ben La'ashri, has some very incredible insights regarding the Tsar that Yaakov had, especially with respect to the Machlokes of Yosef and his brothers, and the Mechiras Yosef, which Yaakov thought that Yosef died. But one interesting question before we really delve into those is, why doesn't the Pasuk discuss the fact that Yehuda's two children, even though it's later on in the Parsha, but it seems to be that there's no hint that this was also a tsar for Yaakov, right? Chas Hashem lo yaleinu v'lo yaleichem. This is a terrible tragedy. Yet, if you go through the Psukim, it doesn't seem that this was an issue at all. And the Ben La'ashri addresses this in the piece that's on page Tov Kuf Lamed Hey, Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Migurei. He says this question is really hinted in the first four words in this parsha, which spells out the word Yibum. Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Migurei is the word Yibum, right? Vav Yud Beis Mem is Yibum. Shahaya Ayedei Aviv. Roimez, this is hinting LiYehuda sheyavim kalosei, right? Yehuda, which is a story on itself, lost his wife, and not only did he lose his wife, his two kids died, and ended up being that he had to be miyabim his daughter-in-law, which is the first case of yibum, a whole shaila. How could the father-in-law be yabim the daughter-in-law? We're not going to get into that at the moment. In the first Mishnah Masechtas Yivamis and other mefarshim, ubaha ab b'makom benoi. And in this case, the father came to do Yibum instead of the son. This is also a terrible tragedy to Yaakov that two of his grandchildren should die, especially that the pasuk, does not talk kindly about them. That's why it says Eila, right? We always know that the word Eila means to exclude, and the pasuk is teaching us that this is not a real tzara. Why? Because Yaakov Avinu knew that this whole chain of events had to be in this way in order that the house of David should come out through this extraordinary series of events, as is brought down in the Mekubalim and in the Zohar and the Arizal, that Kodesh Baruch Hu had to sneak in Kaviyachol, the line of David HaMelech. If you look where David HaMelech came from Lot, who lived with two of his daughters, a meistic thing, and Yehuda Kaviyachol was entrapped by his daughter-in-law. He thought he was doing something wrong, even though be'emes it could be that it was a yibum, but I'll be his idea. And yet from these two mices, the house of David came out, which had to be done in the way in order to trick the Tzad HaTumah, the Sitra Achra, to allow these neshamas to come into this world. The reason for this is that the neshama, the Yetzer Hara, Tzad HaTumah says, there's a special neshama, I can't let it come out into this world, but if it comes out through an Aveira, so Mistama, the Tumah will cover the neshama, and I will be able to direct it to do Aveiros. Many times, Avraham Avinu was such a case that Terach lived with his wife Amsaloi Bas Karnavoy when she was a Nida, right? Hashem did it in order that the neshama of Avraham Avinu should come out. It's such a meistic thing. Why? Because in such a case, the Tzad HaTumah will allow this tremendous neshama to come out, thinking that he will have shlita over the neshama and will be able to do terrible averos with it. And that's how HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kaviyachol sneaks in. And this is hinted in the first words of this week's parsha, Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Migurei, which spells out the word Yibum. Now, before we really begin, there's just a very nice, cute remez that the Ben La'ashri brings. Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Migurei Aviv be'eretz Kenan. Soifei Tevis, if you take the last word, the last letter of all of these words, Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Migurei Aviv be'eretz Kenan, is Gematria Ner. Shebechol Shana, the Ben La'ashri sees, Kishmesayim Kriyas Parsha Zu, Madlikin Neres V'Chanukah. Whenever we finish this parsha, we always light the candles. Either it's the first night of Hanukkah, right? Or in this year, it won't be Motzei Shabbos, it will be Sunday night, but it's always right around the time that we light the Hanukkah candle. And this is a hint to this concept, which is hinted in this week's Parsha. It's brought down in other Sfarim as well, that this Parsha is connected to the Indian of Hanukkah. Unfortunately, we don't have the time really to delve into it. We should know there's great secrets in this week's Parsha that are connected to Hanukkah and to Yosef and to Yaakov Avinu. Now comes a very interesting shaila, which we prefaced in our introduction. It says in page Taf Kuf Mem, B'Rashi Bikesh Yaakov Leishav B'Shalva. Everybody knows the famous Rashi, that why did all this happen? Yaakov Avinu wanted to live in peace, and there's a lot of different midrashim and pshatim what peace means. But Rashi says, as a result of Yaakov wanting to live B'Shalva, Kafetz Alav Rogzer Shel Yosef. Yesh Ledaktik. Lo Dafka Yaakov Bikesh Leishav B'Shalva. Why was Yaakov the only one that wanted to live in peace? What about Avram Avinu? What about Yitzchak? V'lo nimtza sheyomer she'Avram Yitzchak bikshul Leishav B'Shalva. Oid yesh Ledaktik al Omer Zal. Right? That the anger or the punishment, the tsar of Yosef jumped onto Yaakov Avinu. It suddenly appeared to him, right? Everything was bliss, everything was great. In the morning, Yosef went to find his brothers, and within an instant, Yaakov Avinu's whole world was turned upside down. Says the Ben Lashri, why specifically the rugs of Yosef? Was it any worse that, as we mentioned before, that two of his children died, and it's true that we already explained why, at least one shot, this wasn't a tsar. Misa chatufa rachman son, right? As we, if you learn in the parsha, we see it was a terrible misa that happened instantly. In addition, there was a tremendous busha b'maisa tamar uke'edus chazal, right? Lamaisa, however you want to farteich the story of Yehuda and Tamar, which is not the purpose of this shir, even though, as we mentioned before, ultimately there was a purpose for it, until everything was settled, it was a tremendous embarrassment for Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov was the tzaddik hador. And imagine, this is what happened to his son. His son got caught up in this thing. And yet, it seems to be that there was no mention at all. So, what's pshat? So this whole Maisa of what happened with Yosef and Yehuda has to be understood with the following introduction. How could Yaakov Avinu marry two sisters? And according to the Shita, that Bilah and Zilpah were also sisters of Rachel and Leah. Maybe they were half sisters, but they were still the daughters of Lavan. In Cain, it comes out that Yaakov Avinu took four sisters. The Tirtzu, and the answer is, and now we have to understand the deep yisoid here that runs through the story of how Yaakov Avinu married two sisters, or four sisters, and what was the argument between Yosef and the brothers, and why Yaakov didn't necessarily put an end to what Yosef was doing, and rather he let it, continue, and I don't want to use the word fester, but seems to be that Yaakov didn't mind or didn't stop Yosef from what he was doing. So with that, you have to understand the following idea. V'tirtzu, sheYaakov Avinu al v'sham sirulei shekvar yatzu midin b'nei Noach, v'dino ken Yisrael, u'b'nois Lavan yesh lam din b'nei Noach v'giram. Yaakov Avinu was under the opinion that the house of Avram were no longer b'nei Noach, and they were now full-fledged Jews. This is a big machlokes, as we're going to see. This is machlokes between Yosef and the brothers. What was the status of the children of Avram? Was Avram, when he did the Milah, now a Jew, and therefore Yitzchak was a Yid, and Yaakov was a Yid? Obviously, Rivka was Megayer, and therefore Yehuda. And this comes to a whole other shalshalas, an interesting topic. Is Eisav considered a Yid or not? We have to understand this concept, and this is, unfortunately, because it's a very interesting idea, above the scope of this conversation, of this shir. But according to this idea, it seems to be that Eisav was a full-fledged Jew. And if he married somebody and they were Megayer, their children could also be Jewish. That could be why he went to Bnei Yishmael, because Bnei Yishmael are not considered Yidden, because Hagar was not Megayer, because it was before, seemingly, maybe, we have to know. And if she was Megayer, so is Yishmael also a Jew? Okay, that's a very deep and complicated topic, which is, as we say, above the scope of the shir, but you should know it's a sugya that is discussed and really should be ma'ayan at some point. And therefore, he felt that he was a Jew, and the daughters of Lavan were b'nei Noach, and he had to be megayer them. So if they were megayer, even though they biological sisters, even though they are biological sisters, they are not halachic sisters. Now, even though in such a scenario we do not allow an individual to marry two sisters, which means if there were two sisters that it became gerim, right, we would not allow an individual in the time that you were allowed to have two wives to marry two sisters because it doesn't look nice. But lamaisa lehalacha, there's no problem. Ve'elahem shum yichas mishpacha, there's no more mishpacha. Lefize madi kamal hakadosh baruch hu Avram Avinu olav kum hisalach baretz kana bechazaka lefize ein lo matir tzatosis that geras tchilas from Leidas Yitzchak, right? That the geras only came from Leidas Yitzchak. Taksiv be'eretz lehem be'eretz Canaan kina Avram Avinu olav Hashem bechazaka. If Avram Avinu was a yid, he was kana eretz Yisrael bechazaka v'ave eretz shalahem. So this just is further delving into the idea: what was the status of Yaakov? Was he still considered b'nei Noach, or was he considered a full-fledged Jew? Lezeh bikesh Yaakov leishav b'shalva. Shebezeh yachsuk shitasoi. Why did Yaakov Avinu want to live b'shalva? He was a tzaddik. Every tzaddik understands that there's an avodah, that life is not easy, that there's nisyonis, and part of the growth of individuals is nisyonis. But why did Yaakov want to live b'shalva? Shebezeh, by living b'shalva, yachsuk shitasoi shemutu lisa rachav leya. There's no longer the beginning of the Gals and Geras. Ach yedua masha kosav froshes drachim. The masha amar Yosef al achav she'oich le'evim merchai. Now we come to the second stage of the machlokes between Yosef and his brothers. That Yosef was complaining that the brothers were eating oichle menachai. What was the basis? What was the point of contention here? They were eating when the animal was still in the throes, jumping around. After the shchita, right? Sometimes an animal still jumps around. The svirluhu, the dina kebar Yisrael, the b'shchita toli milsia. They held that we are like full-fledged Yidden, and what is considered the death of the animal is the shchita. And now that we did a kosher shchita, the fact that the animal is still jumping, is still, twitching, that's not a din of psulim. The memisatalia. Yosef said no, that you have to wait until they're fully fledged, completely dead, not even moving. Right? So that was the machlokes. Yosef tained that we are b'nei Noach, and therefore you should have waited until the animal completely died. The brothers tained that we are b'nei Yisrael. The problem was Yaakov Avinu should have sided with the brothers. L'shitasai, according to his own opinion, that Yaakov was a full-fledged Jew, and he had to be Megayah, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. It seems to be that what the brothers did was correct, and Yosef's argument was not correct, because Yaakov Avinu himself held that he was a full-fledged Yid. Memela, once you did Shchita, that should be enough. Yosef seemed to argue, but Yaakov Avinu was Shosak, and therefore Shtika Havalek Hoidod Halacha Kamoisai. It seems to be that he agreed with Yosef that they were still B'nai Noach. And if they were still b'nei Noach, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah did not have to be Megayer. And back to the question, how could he be married? 4 sisters. Here's the problem, says the Ben Ashri. So let's re-summarize. Yaakov Avinu held that Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah had to be Megayer because Yaakov was a full-fledged Yid. Once they were Megayer, they're no longer halachic sisters. There's no Isser anymore for me to marry these 4 women, because halachically they're not sisters. Yes, biologically they're sisters, and as we mentioned, it's not something that we do today, but halachically there's no problem. And furthermore, the Shvatim, excluding Yosef, agreed. They also held that we were our Bnei Yisrael, so much so that once we did shchita on an animal, and even if the animal is still somewhat alive and is twitching, we could eat from the body, because the shchita kashes the animal. Yosef HaTzadik said, no, we're still B'nai Noach, and B'nai Noach has to wait until the animal is completely dead. Shchita is not enough to kasher the animal. Yaakov did not disagree with Yosef, which means he seemed to have agreed that we are still B'nai Noach. So if we are still B'nai Noach, then the geras of Rachel, Leah, and Bilhah and Zilpah were not necessary or were not effective. And Memela, how could you have married 4 sisters? That was the conundrum that happened here. And this is what the pasuk is hinting us. This problem that Yosef reopened up, this problem was what jumped on Yaakov Avinu. Which means that Yaakov Avinu, up until this machlokes of Yosef and Yehuda and the Shvatim, had a paskind that he was a Yisrael and the sisters had to get gerus, and now they're not halachic sisters. But now that Yosef argued with him and he seemed to have agreed, it opened up this new wound, this new kasha back to Yaakov. How could you marry 4 sisters? So this whole tsar only came because he seemed to have agreed with Yosef. Nothing to do with Yehuda. This whole thing came because Yosef came to Yaakov and he said the brothers are not acting correctly. Yaakov should have told them they are acting correctly because we Yisraelim. The fact that he didn't, this now caused the kasha, the taina on Yaakov to come back, and that led to the whole problems. And he said, I should not have been quiet. Yaakov Avinu's whole tsar was that he realized that he sort of paskin against himself, and that caused all these tsaras. And he said, I should have not stayed quiet. I should have told Yosef, you're paskening wrong. And if I would have told him you're paskening wrong, there would have been no complaint against me, against the fact that I married 4 sisters, because in reality, I hold I did not. But the fact that Yaakov did not argue with Yosef and was quiet, it seems to be that he agreed with Yosef, and that now caused the whole tsar of Roizer Shel Yosef specifically, and nothing else. Now, a little bit with respect to piercing the veil, looking behind the curtains. Lama Parshat Zustuma, shenismuch mimenu kol hatzar shabarnam. Vayichai oisim yud zayin shana shaloi b'tzar. The last 17 years, Yaakov Avinu lived shaloi b'tzar v'shaloi b'yetzahara mein dugma l'haba. He lived a perfect life. The last 17 years, right, he was perfect. V'es zeh hirgish Yaakov b'ruach HaKodesh. Al kin choshu sha'ata b'shuvay milavan v'yinatzlum Eisav v'saru kvar giya zman shal vasoy. At the moment that Yaakov finally settled with his father, he actually thought that this was now the time that he would live b'shalva. That the last 17 years of his life that he did live b'shalva, really he thought started the moment he came back with his father. However, that didn't happen. The truth is, there was one more nisayon that he had, was how to deal with the tsar of Yosef. Which means, in reality, he was missing this nisayon, how to overcome the nisayon of not having his beloved Yosef, and how he would handle it. This is a tremendous tsar. Belashi says that Yaakov Avinu could not have lived in the ultimate peace, in the ultimate shalva, to be the 4th regal of Hashem, to be the bechir of the avos, to be the perfect tzaddik that could be mashpia and be mevar all the nitzotzis, only once this nisayon happened. This specific nisayon of Yosef, who also was Midas Yisoid, right, who also was the beginning of the Bira process Mitzrayim, could only have happened in order for Yaakov to live b'shalva. Which means Yaakov Avinu thought that the moment he finally left Lavan, he finally defeated Eisav, he finally came back to his father, together they would sit and learn, he would be the ultimate level, and it would be living b'shalva. And the answer says the Ben Lashi, no, he needed one more nisayon to perfect him 100%, like Avram Avinu to some degree, and that would bring him to the ultimate level. That's why specifically the Rogzer Shel Yosef. And once he overcame that nisayon, Yaakov Avinu came to live to the highest level, to the perfect level, and really protected Klal Yisrael in Mitzrayim.